Hey, welcome back to Murdock's Music Minute. It's another of my getting into videos where I look at the discography of an artist or a band and try to pick five regular studio albums that I would suggest for beginners with this artist. So, what are the five albums I would recommend to start with in order to get into the discography and in order to find out if this artist is worth a deeper dive for you? So, if you are an expert on the artist in question, this is probably not the video that you're looking for. Still, it might be fun to keep watching in order to then maybe discuss in the comment section with me what five albums you would pick. So this is as other people would call it, a primer. And today it's a primer for an artist who had a huge cultural significance, still has, even though he passed away several years ago, and who had a significant influence, especially on pop music, pop culture in the 70s and the 80s. David Bowie, often also called a pop chameleon or an alien, an artist who never shied away from innovation, experimentation, and doing unusual artsy things in the context of a rock or pop album, but also an artist who most of the time managed to retain a wider popular mainstream appeal. David Bowie was born as David Jones in Brixton, came from a kind of middle class family. His mother was a waitress and his father worked as a promotions officer for children's charity. Bowie, as a child, already developed an interest in the arts, in theater, but mostly in music. He formed his first own bands in the early 60s. Apart from the guitar, his actual first instrument or his first love interest in terms of instruments was the saxophone. He played in rock and roll bands, R&B, beat music, but also jazz. He studied arts and design, but in the late 60s decided he wanted to try and become a real professional musician. He took on the alias of David Bowie, named after the inventor of the knife, in order to also avoid confusions with Davy Jones, who was then the heartthrob in the Monkees. But the first few albums by David Bowie saw him as an artist who tried his hands at various styles in order to find success, but also in order to find his own niche maybe, or his own style as a pop artist. The five albums that I picked for starters with David Bowie are not the very, very early ones, but also not necessarily the only ones that you should listen to by David Bowie. I would also not necessarily claim that the five ones that I picked are his very, very best ones. In fact, there are one or two albums that I prefer over those five that I picked, but still, those are albums that I wouldn't say are among the first five that you should go to if you are new to the discography of David Bowie. So I hope you catch my drift here, what I'm trying to do with those getting into album selections. The rules also are that, of course, no compilations should be included, because that would be the easy way out. And I would simply suggest to get a few best of compilations. And usually I also do not include double albums, though I think with David Bowie we never got any studio double album. Anyways, so the first one that I suggest for beginners, and I go through those 5 albums in chronological order, is actually his 4th album. Still an album that saw David Bowie as somebody struggling to, get a foot in the pop business, but the first album that could be considered a mild success, and nowadays one of his albums that are regarded as essential. There are even numerous Bowie fans who would argue that this is one of his very, very best albums. I'm talking about Hunky Dory from 1971. So this was his 4th release after a self-titled, rather Baroque pop novelty album in 1967, and 2 more albums that already had a bit more character and saw David Bowie experiment with psychedelia, a bit of space rock, and also heavier guitar tones. Hunky Dory arguably sees Bowie at the doorstep of glam rock. It's not yet a fully fledged glam rock album. In fact, it has folk and pop elements, but one can hear the traces of things to come in British pop and rock music. Hunky Dory was maybe Bowie's attempt to establish himself more as a pop songwriter and deliver an album with artsy elements as well as a more upbeat sound and style. It's very much piano driven as opposed to the heavier guitars he sported on the predecessor album. It features some of his most gorgeous and catchy tunes, but at the same time also has some really odd and quirky songs to offer. And for the first time, Bowie proved that he was capable of writing successful radio singles. It was not the first album to feature singles that were played on the radio. His first actual hit, of course, was Space Oddity, but the album accompanying that single somehow flopped. But with Hunky Dory, critics and listeners for the first time started to turn an ear on Bowie. This album features classics such as Changes, which also opens the album and can be seen as a kind of mission statement for Bowie's entire career. Changes is what defines his entire discography, his artistic approach, I guess. It's a joyful and catchy piano pop song. Then this album also contains maybe his best ballad ever, Life on Mars. Also maybe his first true glam rock song, as well as the catchy swagger of All the Young Dudes, a song that became more famous in the version of Mod the Hoople. Other songs on this album are a bit more intimate, but also maybe a little bit darker, like Quicksand. And Bowie references both Warhol in very strange but also somewhat intriguing song called Andy Warhol, and Bob Dylan. This mostly acoustic album, however, ends with the edgier Queen Bitch, clearly pointing towards David Bowie's maybe most popular glam rock phase, which should follow shortly after Hunky Dory. And with Hunky Dory, indeed, everything more or less turned out fine for the struggling young artist, who now really had a kind of serious career on his hands. Hunky Dory sort of provides you with the musical DNA of David Bowie. All the elements that make him as an artist are present here, and he would develop those elements further, or maybe also sometimes play with those elements, and sometimes also deliberately deviate from those elements, musical elements, on all the albums that followed. One of them being his very next album, the album that overnight made him a superstar, an icon of pop history, leader of the glam rock movement in Great Britain. Of course, it's the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust, with the full title being The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. This one came out in 1972 and marked a quantum leap in Bowie's career. It can be considered a concept album, an album he more or less recorded back to back with Hunky Dory. A lot of the songs on Ziggy Stardust had already been written around the time of Hunky Dory, but the band felt, or Bowie felt, that there was a connected story to these songs, and he came up with this concept of slipping into the role of Ziggy Stardust, a man from outer space, an alien that becomes a rock star in order to save humanity or save the planet Earth from an apocalyptic disaster. So there is quite a bit of a dystopian red thread running through the story or running through the album. Other issues that this album deals with are fame, artificiality in music or in art in general, but also the use of drugs, and of course one of Bowie's main themes in the early and mid 70s, which was the ambiguity of sexual identity. So maybe also one of the first albums to tackle the issue of maybe gender fluidity, which was something very much en vogue in glam rock in general. And Ziggy Stardust, of course, is the album that, next to T-Rex's Electric Warrior, really kicked off the glam rock craze in the UK. Bowie had a perfect backing band for this, a band consisting of Mick Ronson, his ingenious co-partner for several years, Trevor Bolder on bass guitar, who I believe later on joined Uriah Heep, and Mick Woodmansey on the drums. Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars also saw the teaming up between Bowie and the producer Tony Visconti, who was responsible for a couple of Bowie's hit records in the 70s. So this was a very fruitful phase for Bowie as an artist. But it also led to the lines between Bowie as an artist and his fictitious character Ziggy Stardust getting seriously blurred for a while, which maybe also was one of the reasons why Bowie quickly decided to give up the Ziggy Stardust character, or actually to more or less kill him off after a tour. A lot of the songs on this album are absolutely iconic and belong to the staples of Bowie's catalog. They are often catchy, but also melancholic. A lot of the songs have an elegant mid-tempo groove. The focus is more on the guitars, not so much on the piano, and there are also lush string arrangements. So everything that you would usually connect with glam rock in connection with the singing style of Bowie and the topical content, the topics in the lyrics. It opens with 5 years. Soul Love adds some saxophone and a sleazy groove. A Moon Age Daydream is an absolute classic, one of the maybe a bit heavier rock songs on the album, but still with that rather laid-back mid-tempo groove. Interestingly, this song had already been released a little bit prior to the Ziggy Stardust album by a short-lived band Bowie had founded called Arnold Korn, I think. I have to admit I never heard their version, so the song was re-recorded and integrated into the Ziggy Stardust story for this album, and what a track this is, especially Mick Ronson's guitar, which is really soaring. This track is filled with sexual allusions, references to bisexuality, and introduces Ziggy Stardust, that rock and roll alien from outer space. This is followed by maybe the hit single from the album Starman, another song about Ziggy Stardust, who blows people's minds and maybe also other things by virtue of his rock and roll that he plays and that people, especially the younger people, are listening to on the radio, awaiting the end of the world, basically. This is a very catchy song and yeah, maybe one of the best examples of typical English glam rock. It's filled with nostalgia, it's very catchy, a deceptively simple melody, but great arrangement, very elegantly played, and there are also lots of la-la-las that you can sing along to. Yeah, I could go basically through all of the tracks on this album, but that would rather push the limits of what I am trying to do with this video. Just to name a few more songs, Ziggy Stardust, of course, the sort of secret title track is also quite well known and comes with a fantastic guitar lick or guitar hook line from Mick Ronson. Suffragette City is Bowie's version of a more up-tempo, almost manic rock and roll song, and the album closes with the short but majestic rock and roll Suicide, which also points to maybe darker issues to come. Yes, even people who don't really know a lot about David Bowie or who don't listen to David Bowie are aware of this album, or at least the Ziggy Stardust character. I think this is an iconic, a classic rock album, usually named, at the same level like Abbey Road by the Beatles or The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. So obviously not a bad starting point with the discography of David Bowie. After the huge success of Ziggy Stardust, Bowie felt a bit exhausted, maybe under pressure, and also a bit disillusioned by the whole fame carousel of the music industry. But already the next year, he released another iconic and very successful album in Aladdin Sane from 1972. It's my choice number 3 for the list of getting into David Bowie. This album is sort of the after, or represents the aftermath of the Ziggy Stardust success and the Ziggy Stardust story. It provides still a typical glam rock sound, maybe even a little bit more up-tempo rock and roll. In places it sounds a bit more aggressive than the Ziggy Stardust albums, but there are also other tracks where a clear jazz influence can be heard and a more artsy or avant-garde approach again to music. This makes it a very varied, but sometimes maybe also a bit less commercial album than Ziggy Stardust. Bowie once described this album as Ziggy Goes to America. He wanted to Americanize his sound a little bit, but also the lyrics often reflect um, impressions or thoughts of Bowie from his experiences during the American tour. The album overall is darker in subject matter, especially on songs like Cracked Actor, Panic in Detroit, or Lady Grinning Soul. An album about also mental instability, fear, and schizophrenia, but also about the destructive and dark consequences of decadence and debauchery. There's some excellent piano playing from Mike Garson on this album, most notably the title track, giving the music of Bowie more dimensions and showing that Bowie wasn't afraid to develop as an artist and to branch out into different genres or to incorporate influences from various genres. So Bowie never seemed to be interested in just being a pop star who would repeat his successful formula with each album. Some of Bowie's most straightforward and memorable singles are featured on this album. The uber glam of Drive-In Saturday and the grooving The Genie, one of Bowie's most straightforward rock and roll songs. Also, the cover artwork is famous and iconic. I know I use this adjective quite often. He once more appears as a kind of downbeat Ziggy Stardust on the album cover. So this is an album that should be definitely on your list of the first 5 albums if you are getting started with the David Bowie discography. In the mid-70s, then, Bowie said farewell to glam rock. He released another glam rock influenced album called Diamond Dogs, which is also, however, one of his darkest, maybe most disturbing albums from the 70s. Really gives a dark twist to glam rock, but also incorporated a kind of schizophrenic soul sound. And ever since Ziggy Stardust, he enjoyed changing his whole persona and his style with each album. He appears not only in different genres with each album, but also he changed his wardrobe, his entire look with more or less each album. Young Americans saw him trying his hand at a more relaxed Philadelphia soul sound. Things then got more confused and experimental with Station to Station, which also saw Bowie in a phase of mental troubles and a rather unhealthy cocaine addiction. And in order to pursue new artistic ways, Bowie then went to Berlin to record a couple of albums that became famous as his so-called Berlin trilogy, even though the third of those albums was mostly recorded in Switzerland, I believe. Bowie was at that time very much influenced by electronic music, avant-garde, German avant-garde composers, also ambient music from the likes of Brian Eno, for example. And this was all reflected in this new music that he put out. And as the number 4 on my Getting Into David Bowie list, I chose one of those Berlin trilogy albums. Actually, it's the first one that he released back in 1977. It's called Low. This was a very bold experimental step for an artist who for the longest time had been considered a glam rock or pop star. The album is split into two very distinct halves. Side one consists of quite experimental art rock, avant-garde pop songs that maybe could also be seen as precursors to a new wave, while side two was exclusively instrumental with ambient rock songs that were meant to reflect observations and the mood that Bowie got from recording in Berlin. The overall atmosphere of the album is rather dark and sad. Bowie wasn't in the most positive state of mind as a human being and as an artist during that time. He tried to shake off his drug habit. And all this resulted in a fascinating album, maybe also a unique album, that saw the return of Tony Visconti as the producer. The album opens with an instrumental, Speed of Life, which introduces the musical palette on this album. There are electronic noises or modified instrument sounds. Also, the drum sound is quite unique on this album. It is very punchy, almost distorted sometimes, and sounds oddly electronic. Keyboards and synthesizers play a more important role in the music, but the guitar still is the central instrument on most of the songs. And despite Bowie's rather experimental approach to songwriting here, the album yielded two quite famous and beloved singles, Be My Wife and, most of all, Sound and Vision. The album track Breaking Glass combines a harsh reggae drum groove with quirky keyboard sounds and a cold, almost sterile delivery from Bowie. One can also hear influences from krautrock bands such as Can or Tangerine Dream in this music. Sound and Vision, despite an odd structure and I think over a minute until Bowie actually comes in with his vocals, is maybe the most pop song on this album. It comes with a dreamy, floating melody, and overall this song sounds like falling asleep after consuming Zoloft or other antidepressants on a plastic island. It's a great tune with a particularly funky bass. Bowie's frustration with himself and his personal troubles are reflected in the lyrics of songs like Breaking Glass or Always Crashing in the Same Car. Bowie worked with Brian Eno on this album, and the latter's presence can be especially felt on the instrumentals on side 2, providing a very moody soundscape that is unique in the catalog of David Bowie. The label first refused to release Low as an album, fearing that this would be a sort of commercial suicide from Bowie, who was regarded an artist in serious and obvious decline. But the album had a respectable chart success, even made it to number 2 in the UK, for example, and in subsequent years has been identified by critics as one of Bowie's artistically most adventurous and important albums. Needless to say that this one also comes with an iconic cover artwork, the shot of Bowie here from the side, creating a certain distance detachment. And this photograph sees Bowie in his style, his look from a film project he had just finished. The Man Who Fell to Earth, I think it's called. I've watched this movie once. It's not a bad film, but also a bit experimental, not the easiest watch, where Bowie very fittingly again plays an alien who comes to Earth. And though Bowie was literally at a low during those years, the Berlin trilogy gave him a new boost in creativity and also cemented his status as the critics' darling. But the ever restless and changing Bowie didn't stick to avant-garde rock. Instead, with the new decade, Bowie wanted to have chart success and maybe also saw a kind of artistic subversiveness in embracing complete mainstream appeal. Some of you maybe know David Bowie rather as that super blonde pop star who sang radio-friendly hits. So let's take a look at that with my final choice for getting into David Bowie, the first 5 albums that I would suggest. And let's jump forward to the year 1983, when Bowie released a no-nonsense pop album, extremely slick, the pinnacle of 1980s production at that point, Let's Dance, produced by Bowie and Nile Rodgers of chic disco and funk fame. The musical landscape had changed considerably since the late 70s. Punk had happened, and then the new romantics and new wave. Pop music seemed to be more dominant than guitar-driven heavy rock music. And Bowie was regarded the godfather by some of those new upcoming new romantic and synth pop bands. But Bowie himself sort of retreated from constantly pushing the boundaries and producing edgy, adventurous pop music. With Let's Dance, he arguably released one of his most commercial albums ever, but maybe unknowingly set the new standards for mainstream pop productions with this album. Let's Dance is very much soul and funk influenced, but interpreted by means of a glossy yet also a bit cold, stiff British pop sound. The title track has become a radio staple, bringing complexity to a pop song arrangement by means of minimalist elements. The opening track, Modern Love, is a kind of let's get the pop show started song. You can shake your hips in a very 1980s fashion to this song. It also introduces a horn section that is very present on the entire album and adds a bit of an almost 1950s, early 60s nostalgia to the new wave pop sound of the 80s. I've already mentioned the title track, Let's Dance, one of Bowie's or maybe even his very most successful single ever. And also China Girl, co-written with Iggy Pop and actually recorded by Iggy Pop a little bit before Bowie's version came out, also became a huge radio hit for Bowie. This album opened Bowie to a new audience, a more mainstream pop audience. Not always necessarily to Bowie's favor, because now he was seen as a slick pop artist who was there to release radio-friendly pop singles that were state-of-the-art for the 80s. And that led to 2 albums that tried to repeat the formula of Let's Dance, but saw Bowie in a bit of a creative dilemma. Nonetheless, Let's Dance, the first of his 80s pop albums, is highly recommended, and it is a perfect album that demonstrates why pop music was such a big thing in that decade. But Bowie would continue to search new creative outlets, and he would continue to develop as an artist throughout the 90s and the 2000s until his sad passing in 2016. And of course, there are a lot of other David Bowie albums that you should definitely listen to and know if you've already become a David Bowie fan after listening to the 5 albums I have just listed. So I wish you a happy discovery of Bowie's studio releases, and of course also let me know if you would suggest the same 5 albums for beginners or whether you would have included completely different albums. Again, with Bowie, it's not so easy because he has released so many quite iconic albums, but not all of them are maybe suitable for first-time listeners. Anyways, keep discovering, keep deep diving, and most of all, stay passionate about music. Maybe see you again for another Murdock Music Minutes. Bye bye.